Hi again. We're asking questions. We're raising questions yet again. This has been a week, when a prominent politician was shot, and that has raised a lot of questions in and of itself. A Mr. Scalise, Steve Scalise, the majority whip in the House of Representatives, was shot in Alexandria, Virginia, and that's raised a lot of questions right there. A lot of people are asking, even on the media, why in the world does this happen? We have violence all the time, and our nation is fraying. It's not unified, and what's wrong? What causes this, and what can we do about it? So I thought maybe we could raise a couple of questions about that. And one of the things, oddly enough, that I found in researching some of this question was an article about UK politicians, British politicians. It was in The Economist magazine, and the writer pointed out that UK politicians are currently a very sad lot, he says. They used to be a great lot because they would come from 3 different sources of great politicians. And one of them was the landed aristocracy, people with a lot of land, like Winston Churchill's family. And another one was business leaders, probably Margaret Thatcher, although she wasn't really a business person. She represented that ilk of society. And then also qualified, educated elites, the Oxford and Cambridge bunch. So people with land, people with business interests, or people with an education. And the writer in that Economist article said that provided a lot of great politicians, whereas now the politicians are all professional politicians, and that's about it. So what about that in America? And maybe we can get to the idea of disunity by looking at that. Well, we used to have the same 3 sources of politicians. First of all, the landed aristocracy provided a lot of our leadership. For instance, FDR. Franklin D. Roosevelt. He didn't have land necessarily, but he had a lot of property and probably a lot of land. And what about the founding fathers? Land, land, and more land. They were from the landed aristocracy. And then we had business leaders also. You might say Kennedy was one of them, not he himself being in business, but certainly his family. And then we also had qualified elites, educated, qualified elites, who ran operations like the State Department and did a very good job of it, especially immediately after World War II, designing the Marshall Plan and so forth. So in Britain, you had previously 3 kinds of political leaders: those who came from the landed aristocracy, those who came from business, and those who came from qualified elites in educational terms. We've had the same thing. Nowadays, what do we have? We have had leaders from those 3 elites. What do we have now? Well, at least in my opinion, we don't have that anymore. And we don't have anybody who is all that impressive like FDR as a result, somebody who could actually make things happen and unify the country. Somebody who could say, this is the way things ought to be, and I'm going to make it happen. Instead of that, we had Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan says this is pretty much the greatest country society has ever seen since the Big Bang, and there's really no need to change it, or at least not very much. Well, what about the people after Reagan? I think we've had qualified, almost, amateurs like George W. Bush or Obama. Many people liked those presidents, obviously. They were reelected, but I didn't find them much beyond good amateurs, certainly nothing like FDR. They weren't able to unify the country by kind of knowing what to do and also knowing how to get it done. That's what we're lacking today. Right now, instead of that kind of elite or that kind of landed gentry or landed aristocracy, what we have to lead the country, and this is an idea that comes from the fact that we had Ronald Reagan for president, we have Hollywood telling us what to do. Hollywood hangers-on, all sorts of stars who go to Hillary Clinton's convention, for instance, and speak on her behalf, and a couple who showed up for the Trump convention. We have Facebook, which means somebody who you may know in Tahiti posted something that looks really important. Now, how qualified is that? Not very qualified. But that kind of information is floating everywhere now in society instead of real solid information and direction from above. Also, and this is the big point, we have the Constitution. The Constitution is now 200 years old. This is a very young country with the oldest Constitution in the world. It's amazing. We have the world's oldest Constitution, except for maybe a couple of constitutions that were older but are no longer being used. Ours is the oldest one in the world. Pretty amazing. So what's the problem? The Constitution used to be a document that could tell us where to go and to some extent how to get there. But right now it's not being used that way. We have the Supreme Court, the legislative branch, and the executive branch, the president, all competing with each other instead of cooperating with each other. When the Founding Fathers wrote that document, I don't think that they meant to say everybody's powers are exclusive. They didn't mean to say the president has executive powers, the legislative power is in the Congress, and the judicial power is in the Supreme Court. They didn't mean to say that. What they meant to say was that all three sections of the government will share powers. There are certain budget-setting ideas and powers in the executive that the president has, for instance. Can the Supreme Court review that? Yes, that could happen. Can Congress take a hand in that? Absolutely. So even though the Congress might have certain powers that it thinks are all its own, the truth is Mr. Trump and the Supreme Court also have them. Well, instead of unifying the country under the Constitution in the doctrine of sharing powers and sharing ideas, what we have is the three branches competing with each other. So we see hearing after hearing after hearing nowadays, for instance, with the FBI director saying this, that, and the other thing, and then the Attorney General saying this, that, and the other thing. Everybody competing with each other and getting on each other's back instead of cooperating, as the Constitution really would have liked to have things. And that has helped not to heal the natural divisions in this country. There's one other point to make about that. This country was founded on the idea of fraying and competing groups, not founded by the Constitution, but in reality. For instance, Puritans came over here, settled in New England, and said, you know, one of the really important things in a new society is schools. So we have the Ivy League. We have old colleges in the Northeast where the Puritans settled, and the Puritans said, that's really important. Give everybody a voice in town meetings and send them to school. This is a great idea. I guess back in England, they had probably tried that out for themselves. Other people came here from England who only wanted property, and they couldn't get their daddy's property back in England because they weren't the firstborn son. They were in many cases the secondborn son. So they weren't going to inherit anything under the old rules. So they had fathers who were feudal lords back in England, and the second sons would get on the boat, come over here, and buy up land or steal land from the natives, and they settled more in the south, and they started plantations, and they became feudal lords, and they kept everybody as stupid as they could because they wanted to be a feudal lord. So education suffered, and the other things suffered that could have made a more modern society. So we have that kind of fraying right away. And there was other fraying throughout the Midwest and the West, even in California as well. That's really deep in our history. And what we need is a constitution, I'm raising this question, a constitution that can overcome this by setting up ideals that we can all strive for, and a method of getting those ideals enacted into laws. The current one isn't doing it. So here's one. A famous American that you've heard of once said, the Constitution should last 19 years because the earth belongs to the living. What a concept. Sounds a little crazy. Who was the guy who had made that outlandish statement that the Constitution should only last 19 years and the earth belongs to the living? His name, of course, Thomas Jefferson. Maybe we ought to listen to him.